Welcome to the Big Four Accounting Firms podcast, brought to you by big4accountingfirms.com. We have a great show today, but before we get to that, I wanted to remind you of a few things. In order to help us grow and bring you the best Big Four content possible, we would appreciate it if you could subscribe to this podcast, share it with a friend, and provide us with a review on iTunes. We'll provide a link in the show notes to this podcast where you can leave us with a review on iTunes. Additionally, I wanted to remind everyone to check out the show notes. We typically provide links to great content related to the show and our website in the show notes. We also provide links to all of our social media accounts in the show notes, so make sure to follow us when you get a chance to stay up to date on all the Big Four news. Thanks and enjoy the show. Today I wanted to provide an update on tax reform, as there has been some recent action that needs to be discussed, as it might have the potential to change the Big Four accounting firms. On November 2nd, 2017, the House Ways and Means Committee Chairman, Kevin Brady, released a draft of legislation that has the potential to become the tax reform bill. And the name of this proposed bill is the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. Now, what are the major notes that came out of this legislation that you should be aware of? There are some things that were anticipated and were finalized with this initial version of the legislation. An example of this is tax rates. Now, tax rates are something that everyone cares about when it comes to tax reform, and there have been many draft proposals of the tax rates released by Republican congressmen and the president alike. But it seems that those have finally been settled upon in this draft pending further markup. Now, in this proposed tax reform legislation, tax rates for individuals will decrease from 7 tax brackets down to just 4 tax brackets. Now, the highest tax rate for individuals will still be 39.6%, but the threshold to pay that will be higher at $500,000 of income for individuals. Now, the rest of the tax rates for individuals are 12%, 25%, and 35%. The corporate tax rate will decrease to 20%, down from 35%. And this is a huge decrease in tax rate, but that is what the Republicans have been pushing for all along. And the reason they want to decrease tax rates for corporations and individuals is to make America more competitive against other countries. Now, another popular change that was made in this legislation was the repeal of the corporate and individual AMT, also known as the alternative minimum tax. Another item that the Big Four care a lot about are the impacts on business, as large corporations are some of the Big Four's largest clients. Any changes to corporate tax law means big changes for their clients. So, what are some changes in corporate tax law? As we said before, the tax rate for corporations was reduced to 20%. Another thing that tax reform seeks to change is it seeks to make America more competitive for corporations by allowing full expensing of property placed in service after September of 2017. And then there are also favorable provisions in tax reform that will allow corporations to bring back money from overseas. Now, the reason Congress and the President are doing this is to encourage companies to bring back money that they've invested overseas to avoid U.S. taxation. And they want them to bring that back to the U.S. and invest it in the U.S. And they don't want to penalize companies with high tax rates on foreign earnings like past administrations have done. They also want to implement a territorial international tax system instead of a worldwide international tax system that exists today. And changing these international provisions of tax law will significantly change the international tax practices at all of the Big Four firms, if this legislation were to pass. Additionally, the legislation seeks to close historical loopholes that allow companies to shelter income offshore. And this is meant to reward companies that choose to produce goods in the U.S. and employ U.S. citizens. The tax reform bill has a target date to get passed of December 31st, 2017. Essentially, Republicans want to make sure that tax reform gets passed by the end of the year. There's no real true date, but they want it to be done before the end of 2017. And if that happens, then there will be huge changes in the Big Four. So what does this mean for the Big Four? Well, it means a lot for them. The Big Four will have to draft responses to the bill, which they all at least have a brief update on their websites right now, and they will have to produce even more content around this going forward. And they've already been providing updates to their clients over the past year, as tax reform has been a discussion for more than a year now. But we finally have draft legislation instead of just a high-level overview and high-level PDFs from the president and Republicans. So now the Big Four will have to hold more detailed webcasts and webinars for their clients, along with providing them with new publications. And it would be a good idea for you to sign up for these webcasts and newsletters so you can get an idea of how the Big Four operate when it comes to thought leadership around new guidance. And this is a good idea whether you currently work for the Big Four or are just a Big Four candidate. Most of these webcasts and publications are free. All you have to do is provide some contact information. And I'll try to provide some links to where you can find these in the show notes to this podcast. Additionally, all the Big Four have created models for their clients, whereby their clients can attempt to model out the impact of tax reform on their companies. And the Big Four will have to update all of these tax models with this new draft legislation coming out. And the Big Four company with the most sophisticated tax reform model is Deloitte. Deloitte's tax reform model is the most popular in the Big Four right now. And I'll include a link to that model in the show notes to this podcast in case you're interested in checking it out. In conclusion, as you progress in your Big Four career, or as you go about seeking which practice you want to work in, you need to make sure you select the practice that is growing. And tax will no doubt be a growing practice if tax reform is passed. It's been 31 years since major tax reform legislation was passed. But when that last tax reform legislation was passed, there was tons of work for the Big Four accounting firms, and many people made partner very early on in their careers. I've heard of people that made partners after being at the Big Four for only 5 to 10 years. So if you want to go into a fast-growing practice and you think tax reform will get passed soon, then you might look into switching into a tax practice. And a good tax practice would probably be international taxes, as there seems to be a lot of changes coming to international tax legislation. In order to stay up to date on tax reform and how it impacts the Big Four accounting firms, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. We'd also appreciate your help in growing this podcast so we can continue to bring you the best Big Four content possible. And you can help us grow by sharing this podcast with a friend and by also providing us with a review on iTunes. And I'll include a link in the show notes where you can leave us a review on iTunes. That's our show for today. Thanks for listening and have a good day.